I would like to bring up our very special guest for tonight. His name is David Leyonhjelm. He's a senator in Australia's Parliament, the first from a classic liberal or libertarian party, which call themselves the Liberal Democrats, as in classic liberalism. As a young man in the 1970s, Leyonhjelm worked with the Young Labour Party to help end military conscription in Australia, proving his libertarian bona fides. He later joined the Liberal Party, which is what the Conservative Party, or what we would consider as conservative Republicans here in the United States, to promote economic freedom even more. But he resigned from that party in 1996 in disgust as Prime Minister John Howard's extremist, in protest of John Howard's extremist anti-gun laws. So he joined something called the Shooters Party, becoming the party's chairman. Creative in his attempts to block leftists from ruining Australia, Leyonhjelm worked with the Outdoor Recreation Party to run a team of shooters that helped prevent the Green Party from forming a majority in 2004. And I checked with him earlier today, and no firearms were discharged in that political dispute. He managed the federal campaigns for the Liberal Democrats, the Libertarians, in 2007, 2010, and in 2013 when he won election himself to the Australian Senate. It is our honor to have such a champion of liberty with us tonight, especially one that gives us a global perspective on what it is to fight for liberty and freedom around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Senator David Leyonhjelm.
Good evening, everyone. I've noticed that a few of you have strange accents, so I'm assuming that I better speak a little slower and explain myself from time to time, just in case you have difficulty with my accent. Your accent is, I don't have an accent, you guys do. But if you find that you don't understand me at any stage, I'm using a term that you're not familiar with, please let me know, and I'll translate it into English. As Jim said in his introduction, I'm a senator in the Australian Parliament. There are 76 senators, 12 from each of the states and 2 from each of the 2 territories. I'm from New South Wales. The capital city of New South Wales is Sydney. Our national capital is Canberra. It's a much smaller city, and if it wasn't for the Parliament there, nobody would go. I was at first elected in 2013, and then I was re-elected last year, 2016, at a federal election. Last year's election was a double dissolution, which meant the entire Senate was up for election. Normally it's only half the Senate. Normally the term is 6 years, and I think that's the same as your Senate terms. Yes, and but unfortunately I only got a 3-year term, so I'll have to fight another election in a couple of years' time. The government never has a majority in the Senate. The government is formed in the lower house, in the House of Representatives. The majority party there forms government. The leader of the party there becomes the Prime Minister. We have a Westminster system like the UK. We don't have a presidential system. And so whichever has the majority in the House of Reps forms the government. The government never has the majority in the Senate. In the history of the Senate, it's almost never happened. And as a result, people like me, who don't belong to either the government or the opposition, are in a position of influence. If the government wants to get a majority or get its legislation through, and it's opposed by the other side, at the moment that's the Labor Party and the Greens Party, so sort of like your Democrats and the Socialists, then it needs the support of crossbench senators like me. There are 12 of us crossbench senators, and the government needs 10 of us if it wants to pass its bills and achieve a majority. Needless to say, that gives me a little bit of leverage, bargaining power, and I'll talk about what I've managed to achieve with that. But every now and then it's quite good fun to be able to say to the government, no, I'm not going to pass your legislation unless you do something for me. It's a bit satisfying from time to time. The Liberal Democrats, I understand both words of our party's name, probably cause a nasty reaction to you. We're not liberal in your terms, we're classical liberal, and we're not like your Democrats at all. We actually believe in democracy. The party was formed in 2001. It was registered for federal elections only in 2007, and I am the only elected member in the federal parliament, but we recently won a seat in the Western Australian Upper House. You call them senates in your state parliaments as well. We call them legislative councils. So we have a member in the Legislative Council in Western Australia. We nearly won a second Senate seat in Queensland in last year's election. We were very narrowly beaten, and we're pretty confident that we will win seats in upper houses, legislative councils in other states in next year, later this year and next year and the year after. One of the topics that Jim suggested I talk about was disruption politics, and whether disruption is occurring in Australia similar to the way it has occurred in the US with Trump's election and in the UK with Brexit. And the answer is yes. And there are some similarities. In 2013, we had a business magnate, he said he was a billionaire, but I think he exaggerated, called Clive Palmer, who established a party called Palmer United Party. And he made a big noise, spent a lot of money on campaigning, and ended up winning 3 seats in the Senate in the 2013 election. And it was kind of a protest vote. The voters were essentially saying none of the above. His party didn't really agree on anything much, so they all fell apart and went their own way, and that party no longer exists. Well, if it does, it certainly doesn't have anybody in Parliament. But then in the 2016 election, another party called Pauline Hanson's One Nation turned up, and they're a bit more organised and they're a bit clearer about what they stood for. They won 4 Senate seats, and they're now sitting in the Senate along with me. What is significant about it is that since 2007, each federal election since then, the number of voters voting for a minor party, in other words a party other than the Liberal Party and its coalition party, the Nationals, so we'll just talk about the Liberals, that's on the Conservative side. On the left-wing side is the Labor Party, and the Socialists are the Greens. So we if we define them as mainstream parties, the number of voters voting for non-mainstream parties in the Senate has increased each election since 2007, and is now at 24%, just under 25% as a matter of fact. Really quite significant. It basically means a lot of voters are saying, we don't like any of you. We'll vote for the least obnoxious party in the lower house, the one that forms government, but in the Senate, which is a genuine house of review and is capable of blocking legislation and does quite commonly, we will vote for a minor party because we don't think the major parties are representing us quite well. And it is having quite a disruptive effect on Australian politics. What are the issues that are driving that? They are, to some extent, similar to what drove Brexit and Trump. Immigration is an issue of some discussion. We have always had a high immigration level. There's always been a degree of uncertainty about it, whether it's taking jobs or not. But mostly Australians have welcomed immigrants. But the nature of the immigrants has changed in the last couple of decades, and we're getting more and more from countries that don't have a European culture to them. And we're seeing that now with a debate on free speech. We have a law, we don't have a Bill of Rights, we don't have a First Amendment or a Second Amendment either for that matter. And so our defences against encroachments on our civil rights are entirely political. We can't go off to the court. And we have a law which makes it an offence to insult, offend or humiliate somebody on the basis of their race, nationality or colour. Now you can imagine what that leads to. Who knows what's going to offend somebody? Offence, in my view, is always taken, it's not given. So how are you to know what's going to offend somebody? So it's caused a huge debate and disruption about what the merits of free speech are all about. A lot of the pressure to preserve the law, so there's a big movement to either at the very least amend the law, or if not repeal it. A lot of the pressure against that is coming from seats where relatively new migrants are now located, and they have what you guys would call a swing vote. They're marginal seats, and their vote can determine the outcome. And they don't want the law to be changed. So what we're seeing in effect is people who don't have a tradition of free speech, coming from countries where free speech doesn't exist, and if you do speak freely, you might end up in jail. They don't like their countries. They're coming to ours, and rather than take on our values and assimilate, and you can almost get your mouth washed out with soap and water for using the word assimilate in Australia, and they're saying, no, we don't want you to have the free speech that you traditionally had. We want you to maintain constraints on it because we think it'll lead to hate speech. You have to be very, very careful about that word hate speech. So the similarity with immigration between Brexit and Trump's support, I think, is there. But there are other issues that didn't influence that vote, and we have budget issues. Our debt and deficit are very high. I don't think we're as close to the cliff as the United States, and we're certainly nowhere near as close to the cliff as the Europeans are. They're further than you guys. But you can certainly see the edge of the cliff from where we are. And if we don't do anything about it, then we will end up in just as much of a mess as Greece has done. We have an energy issue, which I think is an absolute manifestation of poor government policy around this climate change issue. The legislation is known as the renewable energy target. We have a national target of 23.5% renewable energy by 2020. That was reduced from 28% about 18 months ago. In practical terms, that means 33,000 megawatts. We are currently, we have about 17,000 megawatts of renewable energy, and we need another 6,000. No, I've got that number wrong. It's 23,000, megawatts under the new target. We're about 17,000. We have to build another 6,000 megawatts needed by 2020, so that's only 3 years away. So that's 2,000 megawatts per year needs to meet the target. And in 2015, 409 megawatts were constructed. So in other words, we're nowhere near meeting that target. The effect is that if for the baseload generators that don't meet the target, that don't buy enough renewable energy certificates, and it's a subsidy system. It's not the taxpayers who are paying, it's consumers who are paying. So they basically tax the baseload fossil fuel generators in order to subsidise the renewable energy generators. There is a penalty to be paid by the baseload generators, and now instead of buying renewable energy certificates, they are now paying the penalty. You don't really need to know all the details of that to know the end result is that we have a high and rising cost of electricity and nobody willing to build new baseload power stations. It's possible, it's likely, I think, that some of you would know about the blackout in South Australia. The entire state went black for 24 hours or so. It was due to a combination of factors. They have a high reliance on renewable, but also there was some bad weather and things like that. Nevertheless, none of it would have occurred but for the high reliance on renewable energy. And it was a wake-up call. It was a canary in the coal mine. The reality is that next summer, or possibly even next winter if it's particularly cold, there will be peak demand on electricity and there will be blackout somewhere. And it's all a consequence of this renewable energy target. If it wasn't for the renewable energy target, none of this would have occurred. Now, and the reason that we know that there's going to be blackouts is because nobody is building baseload power stations. Nobody wants to build them because of regulatory uncertainty. The market is there, the demand is there, we need the electricity. We've got industries that want to build and expand and invest and so forth, but they won't do it because electricity costs are too high. And we also have companies that are prepared to build baseload power stations, but they won't do it due to the regulatory uncertainty. And in the meantime, we have this ridiculous target for additional wind turbines, but even they're not getting built. So it's a sad and sorry situation. And quite likely, it will end up with taxpayers' money being spent building a fossil fuel power station, or at least priming the pump to build a fossil fuel power station with guarantees, government guarantees. Totally unnecessary because the private sector could and should be doing it. Now, we have more coal than you can poke a stick at. There are lots and lots of coal in Australia. We have lots and lots of gas. Nuclear power is banned, but we have lots and lots of uranium. And just to finally end the sad and sorry regulatory situation, we also have bans on exploration and fracking, exploration for gas and fracking in several states. Only one state is really welcoming of extraction of natural gas, especially by fracking, and yet we have lots and lots of gas. So it's a poor situation, and we are going to have to use pedal generators, I think, to recharge our smartphones for the next few years until the penny finally drops. But it's not all bad. My position in the Senate allows me to leverage my vote and get some concessions from the government from time to time. There's a very large rifle range in Sydney which was in danger of being closed. I negotiated with the government to have a permanent lease or a 50-year lease put on that rifle range, so now the shooting sports, at least on that big range in Sydney, are now secure. The government was in danger of allowing our Secret Service, no, your Secret Service protects the President, your spies, I don't know what you'd call them. Our ASIO, our spy network, was being given some new powers, and one of the powers would have, by default, allowed them to torture people and without being prosecuted. The government said, oh, well, they're too nice a people, they would never do that. But we, for some reason or other, I didn't quite believe them, and said, well, I don't care, you better change that or you're in trouble, you're not going to have my vote anymore. So they did. I established an inquiry into the nanny state, and we've made lots of sensible recommendations, most of which have been ignored, but we did set off a very vigorous debate about the nanny state and how far it intrudes into our life. In this current Parliament, I have a red tape inquiry. I'm the chair of it. Our Senate is big on inquiries. It's a major part of its activities. And so we're inquiring into red tape. We hardly knew when to start. There's so much red tape. The government was negotiating with me over my support for an industrial relations bill a few months ago, and it wasn't a particularly nice bill. It had some coercive aspects to it, but like a lot of legislation, it wasn't all bad either, and its intentions were good in that it was designed to clean up rather criminal and bullying type behaviour in the building industry by a particularly bad union. So, you know, I sort of thought, well, I could vote against it, in which case the good bits won't occur, or I could try to get the bad bits taken out. But the problem was it relied on the bad bits, the coercive elements, in order to achieve its purpose. So what I did was introduce instead the concept of liberty offsets. So I said, well, I'll vote for your bill, but you have to agree to improve liberty somewhere else. And just to complete the picture on that, my rules are on everything that comes up in the Senate is I'll never vote for an increase in taxes or a reduction in liberty. So if I can get an increase in liberty, then that's good. So as a result of those negotiations, our publicly funded broadcasters now have to hold public forums, or the boards of these organisations now have to hold public forums in regional areas and actually listen to their constituents, instead of just the inner suburban Greens voting socialists who think they represent the rest of the world. Our Treasury is now reporting per capita GDP, spending, all that sort of stuff. It will be quite a revelation when it first comes out in May this year, next month, when it's discovered that GDP per head has not been increasing now for quite a long time. If you have an immigration program, if your GDP is going up, but you also have an immigration program, it is always possible that overall wealth is not going up, wealth per head. And I think that's been the case in the United States now for quite some time. And I'm pretty sure it has been the case in Australia too, but it hasn't been reported, hasn't been analysed properly. And I think it's an explanation for the disruption vote as well, in addition to the immigration issue. And there's a free speech issue in relating to court reporting. Courts are frequently putting suppression orders on court criminal trials, and so that the media can't report on them. It's a free speech issue, and I've forced a review on that. I've got a number of private bills in the Senate, and they prompt debate. They don't usually pass, private bills, but they force the government and the opposition to consider their position. Things like free speech, penalty rates, that's additional mandatory wages for working on weekends, and assisted suicide. Now, I suppose after having been negative about our energy situation and our budget situation, and I didn't spend much time on our budget situation, but there is no appetite for fixing it. There's no political courage involved in cutting back spending and reducing taxes at the same time, which is what needs to occur. In fact, I tell a little joke about the European leaders after negotiating over Greece. They had many meetings about what to do about Greece. And after one of them, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg came out to talk to the media, and he said, well, look, we actually know, we all agree on what should be done, but none of us know how to do it and get re-elected. And that's pretty much the situation we have in our country. They know what should be done, but they don't know how to do it and get re-elected. We have a crisis in energy, which I think will only get solved when we have more blackouts. And it's a sad thing to say, but I think that's where we're heading. And it's such a tragedy. Historically, Australia had low-cost energy, and it was a major competitive advantage, and so it should be, considering we have plenty of raw materials. We have a crisis in the budget. We are heading closer and closer to the cliff every year. Our government says the right things about fixing it, but that's not the same thing as doing it. And I think it'll probably head to a crisis. Interest rates might go up. There might be a crisis in Europe or here, which will affect our situation. I don't know where it'll come from, but I think a crisis based on poor budget management attributable to poor budget management is likely to occur. It is conceivable that the only Nixon could go to China type argument might be relevant, that only a left-wing government will make the serious decisions, will make the decisions needed to wind back on welfare, reduce middle-class welfare in particular, and basically ask everyone to take a haircut, and maybe they are the only ones that could get away with it. That is possible. The problem now is we have a right-wing government. If they try to do that thing, they're just cast as heartless and mean and dreadful, and not to be supported. So that is quite possible. But anyway, after having cheered you up, can I say I am very, very pleased to be in America talking to fellow libertarians. It is a lonely life sometimes, being a libertarian in Australia. I find the brain food that I get from the libertarian think tanks in America to be incredibly useful and reassuring. It's lovely to know that there are people who think like me and my party here, and in fact quite a lot of you really, and I hope you really keep doing it because we rely on you. And finally, can I say, this is being a little bit cheeky, but a lot of Americans assume that your laws are the same in our country regarding politics and donations and so forth. So I just thought I'd mention, if you're talking to any of your big donors, there's nothing illegal about donating to a political party in Australia from outside the country. I think I might leave it there. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Senator. So we all kind of know the rules. Please raise your hand. A microphone will find its way to you. State your name so our guest knows to whom he is speaking. And we will start with the Helen Thomas of our organization right here. Getting the first question, as always, is Larry Greenberg.
Well, I will try not to be obnoxious in that case. You didn't touch on the subject of foreign policy. One thing here about libertarians is, rightly or wrongly, we're accused of being isolationists because we have this two-ocean approach, and of course you're an island. So that we have this idea about liberty, which and also non-intervention in cultures where we presumably have no business, and yet we're a trading nation and we invest in other countries, etc. So there are obligations and sort of crises that you can see today that we have. What is the Libertarian Party in Australia's view of this sort of situation?
Yes, this has come up with some of our meetings last week as well with libertarians. Foreign policy is a major point of contention, as far as I can tell, within libertarian circles here. It's not at all an issue in Australia. The truth is, we, Australia, sort of cooperate with American foreign policy substantially in order to reduce our defence expenditure. We stay under the American umbrella. We send relatively modest numbers of forces to reinforce some of the United States commitments. So we have some forces in the Middle East, for example. We had forces in Afghanistan, and we've had them in Iraq. We still have them based air jets and refueling and so forth in where are they based? Qatar, I think. So, but in comparison to the United States commitment, it's relatively small. It's not for it's not because we think our enemies are emanating from that area. It's because it signifies our strong support for America, and then America has bases in Australia, so that if Australia was ever threatened, we would be able to call on America's military to back us up, and we wouldn't have to pay for it. That's the logic. So foreign policy, that sort of foreign policy debate doesn't exist. My personal view is not an isolation. I hope America doesn't become isolationist. The problem, I appreciate the value of the arguments on both sides. I've heard them many times, but I actually think America's values, which I share, almost entirely, are the right values, and imposing them on others may not be legitimate, but preventing others from having to suffer values that are not the right ones is a legitimate thing from time to time. So you have to get down to specifics like Iraq and Afghanistan before you can make any sense of that. But in broad terms, my view is America has a legitimate role as a source of decency, the rule of law, capitalism, free markets. Those sorts of things are worth supporting. And if America was to retreat and become isolationist or just stay at home, something would fill that void, and they wouldn't support those values.
Thank you, Senator Leyonhjelm. Very interesting. I was just wondering, in the United States, we have very active private media, both radio and television. I was wondering what the situation was in Australia, whether it's more government-owned, and what the result is regarding your politics.
Yeah. Well, the majority of our media is privately owned, but we have two government-owned networks, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and the Special Broadcasting Service. They cost taxpayers $1.5 billion, $1.6 billion a year. The SBS, the smaller one, does allow advertising. ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, doesn't allow advertising. The situation with both of them is that they take, I think you understand the term, a progressive approach to politics. They are either barely tolerated or despised by the right wing of a political debate, and they're generally regarded to be very heavily biased towards the left side of politics. There's always a question as to whether anything should be done about that. There recently was a new chairman appointed, chairman of the board, but he then was quoted a few days later saying, "I never detected any bias in the ABC." You know, almost every conservative commentator in the country fell off their chair laughing. So, but to some extent, my view is I don't think you could have a publicly funded broadcaster anywhere in the world that isn't relatively left-wing and progressive. I think it almost goes with the territory. So the question is, you know, how much money do you give them, and can you sort of keep them from overwhelming the discourse? My main criticism of them is that they cost so much money and they crowd out the private sector in certain areas. They're the two areas I worry about. I don't worry too much about their bias. I don't think it's fixable, but starve them of money and make it more feasible for competitors, commercial competitors, to operate, I think would be how I would deal with them. Of course, I mean, if I was dictator for a day, I would privatise them, but I'd have to give them away because they don't make a profit.
If you were dictator for a day, we'd have to take away your Libertarian card, for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
You have a question over here to your right.
Good evening, Senator. My name is Mike. I'm just curious what the current state of private civilian gun ownership is in Australia, specifically. Who can own a gun? What are the requirements for owning a gun? What percentage of the private population currently owns guns? And what kind of weapons can you own?
Mm-hmm. Yep. I'm a gun owner. My senior advisor here, Max, is also a gun owner. We have criteria for owning a gun are collecting, target shooting and hunting. And you have to belong to a target shooting club or a collecting club. It varies a little bit by state. And hunting, one way is to belong to a hunting club, but you have to have access to a property where hunting is possible in order to justify it. So the term used is genuine need. You have to demonstrate a genuine need. You have to be 18, although you can get a permit to use a gun at 12 in most states. The kind of guns you can use are pistols for target shooting no higher than 38 caliber, no more than 10 round magazines. Rifles, no semi-automatics, but bolt actions, lever actions, pump actions, no pump action shotguns, but pump action rifles are okay. Please do not ask me to explain that. It's ridiculous. Up to about 357, I think, is most states. There are a bit of variation between the states on that. Very strict storage requirements. If your guns get stolen, there's a better chance that you'll get prosecuted than the thief. Absolutely no guns permitted for self-defence, which is a major point of contention from my point of view. In fact, it's worse than that. You can't have pepper spray, mace, personal taser, or any weapon, indeed specifically for self-defence. If you have a legal right of self-defence, it's either common law or statute law in every state, and it's robustly upheld. But you can't have practical means of self-defence unless you're a martial artist or something like that. That's the issue. And so you can't carry anything specifically for self-defence. If you happen to be carrying, well, pepper and mace and personal tasers are prohibited anyway. But if you happen to be carrying a knife for another purpose and you use it for self-defence, no problem. And you probably won't even get prosecuted. But you certainly have a sound defence. But if you're carrying a knife for self-defence, then you'll be the one that gets prosecuted if you get found. So gun ownership levels, the data on that's very poor. We think there's about 2 million with licences. We thought it was only 1 million up until a few months ago, but then a federal government agency, which seems to be gathering data from the states, which they're the ones that regulate the guns, they seem to have come up with this 2 million figure. Now, so there's about 24 million people in the country. Obviously that includes children.
Yes, David Pirenboom. Does Australia have a central bank along the lines of the Federal Reserve, and could you tell us a little about it?
Yes, we have a federal bank. The government bank is known as the Reserve Bank. It manages the government bond business, buying and selling. It also sets benchmark interest rates, which are substantial contributors to the interest rates charged by the commercial banks. We haven't had quantitative easing and that sort of thing. We've had deficit spending instead. And I understand the debate that arose around Ron Paul's campaign to abolish the Fed. We debated whether or not something similar to that would be relevant in Australia, and came to the conclusion that not enough people knew even about the Reserve Bank, let alone what it did, to justify a campaign of abolition of it. You'll get, when you discuss it with economists, you'll get a range of answers, and that includes libertarian economists.
I have a question here, then we'll go to the back of the room. Senator, when you and I were on the podcast earlier today, we had talked a little bit about how the United States Constitution has a Bill of Rights. It passed because, in fact, we had a speaker in here just last week who talked about the transition between from the Articles of Confederation to the U.S. Constitution, and the Bill of Rights had to be in there in order to get ratified. So the Bill of Rights, of course, is it lays out what the government is prohibited to do against an individual and their liberty. You've obviously just explained how there's no Second Amendment in the Australian Constitution. In fact, there are no Bill of Rights at all in the Constitution, and a lot of people in America, even with the Bill of Rights, we feel like our rights are always under attack. But at least the Bill of Rights offers some sort of protection. What is protecting the rights of the citizens of the people of Australia in lieu of a Bill of Rights?
Yeah. We're like England or the UK in that respect, in that there is no statutory safeguard, I suppose, of our civil rights. We can't go off to the court and say that law is unconstitutional if it infringes too much on our right to free speech or our gun rights or our rights of assembly or worship or anything like that. Our High Court, the equivalent of your Supreme Court, has found an implied right of political free speech relevant to or relating to elections. the court argued basically that elections require political communication. That communication must by implication be protected by the Constitution, given all the other aspects surrounding elections. That's about it. That's about as far as it goes. Most of our Constitution is all about the organisation of government, how we structure our parliament, voting, those sorts of things. When our rights are infringed, and I think they are quite a lot, our only response is the same as in the UK, and that is to be political. There's no other option. And I mentioned to you this law that makes an offence to offend, insult or humiliate somebody on the basis of their race, nationality or colour. That's a free speech issue. That's become quite totemic in the last 2 or 3 years. There's been some high profile. It's a civil offence rather than a criminal offence, but you can still be fined, and so there's been some high profile prosecutions, and procedurally it's been very onerous for some of the people involved, and it's a huge political issue, and the government is would like it to come off the table. They know that it's annoying their own supporters. On the other side of the argument, the Labor Party and the Greens are whipping up fear and concern amongst particularly immigrant communities, saying if this is repealed, it will be a licence to unleash hate speech, and all these people will say things you don't want to hear. Well, I mean, that is what free speech means, hearing things you don't want to hear. So, but we have no court we can go to. It's all being debated in the public domain or in Parliament. You have to be ever vigilant about what your rights are if you are not going to have a court to back you up. There's no other option.
Could you tell us about the Australian experience with a carbon tax?
Yes. Well, can I start off by saying I was very pleased to be one of the senators who voted to repeal it in 2014. The carbon tax was introduced by the previous Labor government, which lost power in 2013, was voted out. I don't remember the exact year. It's something that I've tried to forget. The effect of it basically was to rack up electricity prices. They were going up. We are increasingly seeing what we call energy poverty. So people are not turning on their heating in the wintertime, but are rugging up with their warm clothes and warm blankets and so forth because they're afraid of what their electricity bills will be. And in the summertime, they're going to shopping malls, which are air-conditioned, rather than try either run air conditioner at home if they've got one, or endure the heat. And we're a hot country, so we're increasingly seeing that sort of thing now. The carbon tax was bad policy right from the start because it was based on the false assumption that somehow or other Australia reducing its carbon dioxide emissions would somehow save the planet. How on earth it was going to do that, I don't know. Even if, and I just qualify that, even if you believe that carbon dioxide is a contributor to global warming, Australia's contribution to that carbon dioxide is tiny, absolutely tiny. Even if we turned off every baseload fossil fuel power station in the country and all lived on wind and solar power, 100%, it would add up to about China's emissions of carbon dioxide for one day. A ridiculous assumption that somehow or other all this was going to make any difference. Anyway, it ended up becoming a huge political issue. The government, the previous Prime Minister in particular, was a very strong sceptic on the whole climate change issue and campaigned against the carbon tax, the electricity prices, and won. And the carbon tax repeal was fought furiously by Labor Party and the Greens. They fought it so hard. but the government managed to get enough of us on the crossbench on their side to get it through the Senate. But, I mean, the sad story is that, as I was describing to you earlier, this renewable energy target issue is in fact having an even worse effect on electricity prices than the carbon tax was now. So, you know, we've got rid of one problem, but the other one's equally bad. And the government will not acknowledge that they've got that wrong. They will not acknowledge that the renewable energy target is a major problem. Some of their individual members do, members and senators do, but you know, as a government policy, they're sticking with it. I am in particular, and those of us who are those others who agree with me are living in hope that Donald Trump rips up the Paris Accords or pulls America out of the Paris Accords. That would really sort out the debate in Australia, and we would probably have both sides of politics then say, okay, well, there's no point us doing anything, let's build some coal-fired power stations, and we would go back to cheap electricity again, and the economy would probably improve out of sight.
Right over here.
Thank you. My name is Terry. Has the Australian Senate always been an elective body? For instance, I know in Canada, another British Commonwealth country, the Senate has always been appointed through political patronage, basically. And I believe that's basically the same pattern throughout most of the rest of the British Commonwealth, modeling after the British House of Lords. And I was wondering if you think that having an elected Senate in Australia makes politics there somewhat different from what they are in the rest of the Commonwealth, maybe closer to what we have here in the U.S.
Well, yes. We've only been a federation since 1901, and the Senate has been an elected body since then. I am aware that the House of Lords is appointed. I wasn't aware that Canada's Senate wasn't elected, to be honest. Is it better? Yes. I mean, the notion of a franchise comes up fairly regularly, and so the government will say, we were elected, we have a majority of members in the House, therefore we have a franchise. Everybody should respect that franchise and you know, agree to us implementing our policy. The notion of the franchise came up in England when the government had won the House of Commons, the majority in the House of Commons, and wanted to implement its promise, and the House of Lords was being obstructive, and the House of Lords wasn't elected, so the argument was, well, you should respect the franchise that the government has. We hear that same argument in Australia, except that with the senators all elected on the same basis, that they also have a franchise. So I get asked about this question by the media all the time, and I say, well, look, my franchise is to implement my policies that I was elected on, and I think all the other senators are the same, and the government can implement its franchise if it has the numbers. That's what it amounts to. I actually think our Senate is quite a positive contribution to democracy. There are quite a lot of times when legislation just doesn't proceed because they don't have the numbers in the Senate, and that's not a bad thing. It occasionally improves legislation. It conducts inquiries and makes the government rethink its approach in many cases. It's fractious. It's frustrating. Politics is frustrating. When you're actually a participant in it, you're not an observer from outside, and I've spent many more years being an observer watching it from outside than I have inside it, being a participant. I can tell you once you're inside, it's even more frustrating because you know what should be done, but you can't do it. But I actually think our Senate improves our parliament, improves our democracy. We get better results from it. Now, that's not to say the results are good all that often. They're often not. But I think they'd be worse, but for the Senate.
Excellent. We have a question right here, please, and then we'll have another one there in the back.
Hi, and again, thank you, Senator, for being here. My question is related to the impact of immigration on elections. Certainly, that's a point of contention, not here just in the United States, but specifically in Illinois. Is it because you have a lack of a constitution and a Bill of Rights that actually protects the rights, specifically with amendments that protects your citizens? Does that in some ways become a catalyst for an influx of migrants who would then become, I would say proponents of the Socialist Party or the more progressive parties in Australia?
I'm not sure I quite understand your question.
I guess the question is modern immigration in Australia today actually influencing the way Australia is going toward, it seems like you're moving toward a more progressive state.
Yes, I think it's immigration. You know, if you take a long-term view, and Australia has taken millions of immigrants in since the Second World War in particular. It's been an absolute positive for the country. There's no doubt about it. And overall, I think it continues to be positive. The issue is whether or not, by taking people in from countries which have absolutely no origins, with origins that are cultures that are really quite different from ours, whether we should then allow them to change our culture. That's the question. That's causing considerable concern to a number of people. We have political parties, for example, that are advocating no more immigration at all. And of course, there's several of them that are saying no more Muslim immigration. So what Trump is doing is, we've heard echoes of that, or Trump is trying to do, the court keeps stopping him. What he, his objectives are not at all unknown in Australia. The danger, I think, is that we will get a knee-jerk reaction against immigration per se. And as I said, as a libertarian, I would broadly argue in favour of the free trade in goods, services, capital and labour. But you don't want to transform your society into an illiberal society as a consequence of that. You want to preserve the fundamental rights and freedoms that you inherited, well, basically from the English is where we got them from. So worship, movement, association, speech, of course, and a couple of the other ones, and equality before the law. So you don't want those things to be threatened, and yet I think there are indications that that they are in jeopardy as a consequence of our immigration policy. The same sort of debate is occurring in the UK. We have areas of high Asian immigration where they are trying to impose a de facto Sharia law. They are trying to impose Sharia rules of inheritance, where women get a smaller proportion of an estate, where men automatically get custody of children in a divorce, in a Muslim marriage. And they're saying these are not matters for the state to manage, these are matters for our culture that we took, and we brought them from our old country into our new country, and they're wanting to preserve them in their new country. That's the danger, I think, that we need to be on guard about. And yet, immigration is unquestionably a good thing for our economy. I know some people say, it takes jobs and so forth, but if you get skilled immigration in particular, it doesn't do that. So how do you protect your values? My argument is raise the bar on citizenship. Only citizens can vote, and don't make citizenship so easy that you can, it doesn't make any difference what your values are, you can become a citizen. Switzerland does that quite well. You have to be living there for 10 years. You have to have a good employment history. paid taxes, obeyed the law, not been a criminal, all those sorts of things. And then even you have to be endorsed by your canton, which a canton is the equivalent of a state in Switzerland. And you're not going to get endorsed by your canton if you go running around in a burqa and arguing for Sharia law. Nobody's going to do that. So, you know, that preserves Swiss values. They're basically protecting Swiss values. But provided you've taken on Swiss values, doesn't matter whether you're a Muslim still, if you've taken on Swiss values, you can become a Swiss citizen after 10 years of living there. I'm pushing our government in that direction. They are raising the bar a little bit on citizenship and introducing a test. They're pretty amateurish about it still, but you know, I think that's the safeguard. We have to be on guard against this idea that all immigrants are bad. We have to bear in mind the economic cost of that, but at the same time we also have to protect what we know as our liberal democratic values.
Senator, thanks a lot for coming to the Chicago area just to talk about the situation in Australia concerning freedom and such. Question I have is that in the Asia-Pacific region, China has become a lot more aggressive politically and militarily. How do people in Australia perceive this?
That's a good question. There's quite a lot of concern about that. China is close to, if not our biggest trading partner. Mainly take raw materials, but increasingly also food. And obviously we want them to be peaceful and free trade as possible. We have a free trade agreement with China, and you know, the continued trade with China is absolutely fundamental to our economy. On the other hand, we have a military alliance and a cultural alliance and a cultural affinity for the United States, and we also are encouraging better relations with countries to our north, the Philippines, for example, although Duterte's policy of shooting drug people without bothering with a trial is not something we're in favour of. But so the countries to our north are all quite alarmed by China's policy towards the South China Sea, those islands that have been reclaimed on which they've put in air bases and are now stationing military aircraft are a source of alarm. And I think some sort of understanding will have to come. It's fairly obvious that China is the new aggressive imperialist power of the region, if not the world, and I'm not too keen on where it's heading. It's possible that Trump might try to force the Chinese to blink first. Australia doesn't have the military power to do it, of course, but it's possible Trump might try to force the Chinese to blink over the South China Sea. And I can tell you Australia will be there backing him up as hard as we can manage. We don't like what's happening there.
We have time for a couple more questions. We've got one back here. If you have another one, please put your hand up.
Yeah, my name is Henrik Kowalczyk. I have a few questions, but one is, I think, which wasn't touched. The hot issue in the United States in the last years is healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, I'm a little interested in that issue, and I didn't get the chance to study how it is done in Australia. Is it more like here or more like United Kingdom? If you can, and then you notice my accent. I'm from Poland. I grew up over there, fought with socialism, came here, and almost every time when I come here and speak, I mention the socialist is following me. So that when I came to United States 30 years ago, there was much less socialism than it's right now. And what I hear, what you are saying, and even among people of my orientation, quite often we heard that maybe if we get frustrated here, we'll go over there. Right now, what I hear, at least we need to take our diesel generators and batteries with us. So this is kind of a bit frustrating. But as a last kind of thing which I would like you to touch, we discussed a lot about immigration, and this is other subject which of course I'm interested because of being some immigrant myself. So in Chicago, statistically speaking, about 1/3 of people, I think 30% to be precise, in Chicago itself, speaking home different language, or at least have different ethnicities. They are first generation immigrants. In the United States, first generation immigrants are about 13% and some a little bit more. About 1/3 of those are illegal. So legal is about 10% or maybe a little less. If I know, and you maybe correct me if I'm wrong, that in Australia, foreign borns are approaching 30%, 27, 29, something like that. So comparing what I hear, the kind of problems you have, sound to me very mild comparing to what is perceived here. So I would like a little bit to find out what is your immigration policy, how you manage who comes, and how is the assimilation process. Because in the United States, about half people who are legally, there are people who came illegally, and somehow by marriage, staying, or whatever, they manage to legalize their situation. So otherwise, it is completely uncontrolled situation. The government eventually gives in to those situations. So my concept, which even I was once able to talk about it here, is that what you said is the value of having people who share the value. My point is, let people come as a guest workers. Because then, I don't care what your color and religion is, if you want to work, by work you can test yourself much better. So I'm wondering if Australia has anything of that kind. Sorry for being so long.
That's fine. Well, first of all, your question about guest workers. Yes, we have a special visa called 457, which is which allows people to work in Australia temporarily as guest workers. There are laws about how much they can be paid and all that sort of thing, and they have to be. The government decides whether or not there are insufficient local workers to fill the vacancies that the employers want the 457s for. And sometimes the government agrees, sometimes it doesn't. So it's not a market; it's a bureaucratic exercise. But yes, we have temporary workers, and if they lose their job with their employer, then they must leave the country. We don't have very many illegals. Australia is an island, and it's pretty hard to sneak in. You can't just swim across the river. So we probably have a few thousand visa overstayers and those sort of people. We did have quite large numbers of people, but large by our standard, coming to Australia by boat and landing on the shore and then claiming asylum during the term of the Labor government. It became a huge political issue. They were coming from Indonesia primarily, but their starting countries were some of the Middle East, some Sri Lanka. The government, both the Labor government and then later the Conservative government, were both very opposed to this because they know that public support for our relatively high levels of immigration depend on the perception that we have our immigration under control. When there is a perception that immigration is not under control, then there is much more opposition to immigration in total, legal and illegal. So the people who, in the beginning, when the Labor government was in power, they were holding them in detention camps on Australian soil, but quite a lot of them were being approved as refugees and they were being let out, so it acted as a magnet for more to come to the country. After a while it became, and we had thousands of them in these detention camps. They weren't particularly good camps, although they weren't horrible by any means. They weren't sort of prison camps, but they weren't necessarily all that cheery. And then the government realised that the fact that the refugees were being released into the community and allowed to stay was attracting more, they decided that this had to stop. And so they negotiated with Nauru and Papua New Guinea to establish offshore detention camps. And so the refugees who were in Australia got sent there. I think that's how it worked. Then there was a change of government, and the new government took on a much more aggressive policy of turning back the boats. So when the boats were being detected by the equivalent of our Coast Guard, they were turned around and sent back to where they came from. In some cases, they were put in lifeboats, supplied by lifeboats, and given enough petrol to get back to Indonesia and not enough to get to Australia, and told, this is the way you go, see you later. Sometimes if the refugees sometimes sank the boat they were in, and that was the only option. If the boat was still seaworthy, then they were kept in that same boat, given enough fuel to get back to Indonesia, and sent on their way. That had an effect. We also had a fairly heavy intelligence and propaganda program in Indonesia, telling refugees in refugee circles, don't come to Australia, you won't be allowed to stay. And the government then said everybody who arrived illegally by boat would be sent to offshore detention. And they stuck rigidly to it, notwithstanding the left has gone ballistic over it. And so there are people who've been in detention now for 3 years or so, either in Nauru or in Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. They have been under immense pressure to allow them to come back to Australia, but the government has, quite logically said if they do that, it'll just create hope in the minds of others in those countries that this is a way to get to Australia. We have increased our refugee intake via the UNHCR. In fact, I am quite in favour of taking in refugees, provided they are genuine refugees, preferably of a kind that would have nowhere else in the world to go. So Christians from the Middle East, for example, who are seriously persecuted, Yazidis, they would be my preference, and the government's more or less doing that. They won't admit it because it's contrary to in policy or some damn thing. So anyway, we now have no more attempts to come to Australia by boat, or if they are, they're being turned back. We don't hear about them anymore. I think they've all given up. Those stuck in Manus Island and Nauru have been given the option they can become Nauruans, or they can become Papuans, Papua New Guineans, I should say. And President Obama agreed to take about 1,000 or 1,200 or something from Manus Island, I think, from Papua New Guinea into America. I think they're all Tamils. I don't think they're Muslims, but I think they're all Tamils. And Donald Trump tweeted that he thought it was a terrible deal, but he's going to stand by it. So that will be the bulk of the people from PNG. There might be a few who get rejected by America's extreme vetting, but they will be allowed to stay in Papua New Guinea. Now, the simple thing, of course, is if they're refugees, and they're refugees from their original country and in fear of their lives, well, they have no reason to argue on refugee grounds that they should go to Australia. If they're safe from persecution in PNG or Nauru, then they're safe. That's the whole point of being a refugee, is to get it out of danger and into safety. Healthcare, all right. Well, your question was, are we more like the US or more like UK? I have trouble understanding the US healthcare system, to be honest. So, yeah. I tried to follow the debate. Yeah. I tried to follow the debate here, and I got quite lost. I met Rand Paul, Thomas Massey and Justin Amish last week, and they'd, not long after they'd had the vote and knocked down the replacement of Obamacare, and I heard both sides of the argument. I still don't understand either of them. So our system is relatively socialised. It's probably, if a direction, a comparison between the UK and the US, is probably closer to the UK. We have a publicly funded insurance type thing. You go to the doctor. If the doctor charges you a low fee, you won't pay anything. If the doctor charges you above a set fee, you'll pay the gap. If you go to hospital, again, you will pay either nothing or something, depending on how much the doctor charges. The government sets what they think is what they call it a scheduled fee, so the medical provider will get that back from the government, and anything over that the patient will have to pay. Pharmaceuticals are subsidised as well, and if you're on pensions, the subsidy is higher. It's enormously expensive. We all pay a levy on our taxes to contribute to it. That levy only pays for about half of the actual cost. The cost is escalating faster than the rate of inflation or growth in the GDP or any other measure you like to consider. It's not sustainable long term. Something needs to be done about it. But I think you'll be familiar with the argument that nobody actually knows exactly what to do with it. I'm going to say 9%, but I did a comparison with Singapore a few months ago, and comparisons got Singapore has compulsory health savings accounts, better health outcomes, and a lower cost to GDP. And I'm not sure whether they were 9% and we were higher than that, or we were 9% and they were lower than that. So I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I can't tell you. Yeah, I think it's less than yours, yes. What's yours, about 13? 16, is it? Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Time for just a couple more questions, one right over here.
My name is Art Ellingson. I run the Tea Party around here. I want to know if you met your counterpart from Florida, Ted Yoho. Ted Yoho and you seem to have the same profession. When he went to Washington, he said he was better equipped to deal with many of the Democrats in Washington because he was a specialist in horses' behinds and donkeys' behinds.
I told her a slightly off-colour joke over a sandwich before. I think that's what the gentleman's referring to. I will treat that as a serious question, though. Am I a better politician for having become a politician late in life? Yes, I am. I am a businessman first. I still am a businessman. I haven't been able to find a buyer for my little company, so it's still operating, and I still have to spend a little time on it. My wife works in it, and I have a contractor as well who helps. But every now and then I have to go and do some work on my company, and of course I've got the accounts and various bits and pieces to look after. And to be honest, I prefer business to politics. But if I didn't do it, I often think, who else would be speaking up for small government, low taxes, endlessly reminding the government, yes, you can cut spending, here's a way to cut spending. Endlessly reminding the government there is a private area and there is a public realm. The private realm, you do not belong. Get the hell out of it. Leave people alone. These are private matters. You don't have to agree with people. You don't have to think that you would do the same, but you just have to respect the fact that they're making a choice and they're not hurting anybody else. If I wasn't doing that, the voices would be still there, but a lot more subdued. So I think, well, I have to keep doing it. But my aim is to absolutely replace myself with more than me, hopefully. More senators and more Liberal Democrats in Parliament, in the state parliaments, arguing for lower taxes, less regulation, get off the back of business, get out of your bedrooms, get out of your pocket, leave us alone. When I feel as if I'm being sufficiently replaced, I will either go back to my business or look for another buyer and become a full-time retiree, one or the other. But I am on a mission.
And everyone in this room admires you for that mission, and I will tell you that the Heartland Institute, if you ever need us to come down to Canberra, even though it may not be such a great place to be.
I don't live there. I only go there for Parliament.
All right. We'd be happy to help you out. People in this room are very appreciative of your efforts down there for spreading liberty around the world. Let's give our speaker a round of applause, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. I'm sure the Senator will be lingering a little bit near the end of here, though I need to get him back to a train to get back down into the city on time. So thank you all for being here.